The gun was already pressed against the back of Clark Bailey's head when Hazel Bishop decided she was done running. She heard the hammer click from across the dusty street, saw the way Clark's shoulders went rigid beneath his tan canvas shirt, and felt something inside her chest crack wide open. Not because she feared for a stranger, not because she was a good Samaritan with nothing to lose, but because in the 6 weeks since she had arrived in Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory, Clark Bailey was the only human being on earth who had ever looked at her like she might be worth knowing. And now Silas Greer was going to put a bullet in the back of his skull over a secret that belonged entirely to her. "Tell me where she came from," Silas growled, his voice like gravel dragged over hot iron. "Tell me, or I swear on my mother's grave I will redecorate this saloon porch with what's left of your head." Clark did not flinch. He stood with his hands slightly raised, not in fear but in deliberate, infuriating calm, and he said, "I genuinely don't know what you're talking about, friend." "She is not your friend," Hazel said. Every head on the street turned. She stepped off the boardwalk in front of the dry goods store where she worked, and she walked straight toward them, her boots raising little puffs of orange dust, her heart slamming against her ribs with the force of a war drum. She had a small Remington Derringer tucked into the waistband of her skirt, a habit she had carried across 4 states and 2 territories, and she did not reach for it. "Not yet." "Let him go," she said. "He doesn't know anything because I never told him anything. Whatever you came here looking for is between you and me. So point that gun at someone who actually has the answers." Silas Greer turned to look at her, and the cold, flat recognition in his eyes confirmed everything she had spent 6 weeks praying would never happen. He had found her. Her hidden past had crossed the desert on horseback and arrived in Redemption Creek like a debt collector who never slept. This was the moment everything fell apart. But to understand why Clark Bailey was about to die on account of a woman he had only known for 6 weeks, and to understand why Hazel Bishop had come to this sun-bleached town at the edge of nowhere with no name she was willing to give freely, you need to go back to the beginning. The beginning was a Wednesday in late September, 1882. Hazel arrived in Redemption Creek on the afternoon stage from Santa Fe, and she arrived with 2 things: a battered leather traveling bag that contained almost everything she owned, and a name she had not been born with. The town was small enough that the arrival of a single woman on the afternoon coach was treated as a minor civic event. 3 men came out of the saloon to look. The blacksmith paused his hammering. A woman in a yellow bonnet leaned out of the millinery window and watched with frank, unashamed curiosity. Hazel stepped down from the coach and looked at the town the way a person looks at a locked room they are not certain they want to enter. Redemption Creek sat at the base of the Sangre de Cristo foothills in a shallow valley, where a thin seasonal creek had convinced some optimistic founder that civilization might take root. It had, after a fashion. There was a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, lined with the usual collection of frontier businesses: a general store, a saloon called the Silver Bit, a livery stable, a small hotel with a hand-painted sign, a land office, a barber, and at the far end, a modest whitewashed church that looked like it was trying very hard. There was also a sheriff's office, squat and solid, with iron bars on its single window. Hazel noted the sheriff's office the way she always noted such places, with a mix of calculation and dread, and then she squared her shoulders and walked toward the general store because that was where the job advertisement had said to go. The advertisement had been pinned to a board at the stage station in Santa Fe. It read simply, "Reliable woman wanted for counter work and inventory. Room provided. Inquire at Bishop's General Store, Redemption Creek, NM Territory." The name had stopped her cold. Bishop. Her borrowed name, the name she had taken off a headstone in a Kansas cemetery 16 months ago, because the real Hazel Bishop had died at 22 of fever and left behind no family to contest the borrowing. She had stood over that grave in the gray Kansas drizzle and thought, "I am so sorry," and then she had walked away as someone new. And now, hundreds of miles later, Fate or some dark humor of the universe had led her to a town with a store bearing that same name. She had taken it as a sign. She was 26 years old, she was exhausted down to the marrow, and she needed to stop moving before the moving killed her. The general store was owned by a widow named Margaret Bishop, who was no relation to the dead girl in Kansas, and who ran her business with the focused efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped expecting help from anyone. Margaret was 53, sharp-eyed, and entirely uninterested in Hazel's past. She interviewed her for approximately 4 minutes, decided she seemed capable and not likely to steal from the register, and gave her a room above the store in exchange for 6 days a week of work. "I don't ask personal questions," Margaret told her on that first day, "and I expect you to return the favor." "That is the best offer I have received in years," Hazel said honestly. She settled into the room, which was small and clean and had a window that looked out over the back of the stable, and for the first few days she moved through Redemption Creek like a ghost, quiet and careful, learning the town's rhythms without inserting herself into them. She learned who was friendly and who was watchful. She learned that the sheriff, a lean older man named Aldrich, had a habit of playing checkers on his porch in the evenings. She learned that the Silver Bit did decent business on Friday nights. She learned that the town had a subtle social architecture, the kind of invisible order that every small frontier community develops, and she was careful to position herself in it without drawing attention. She was very good at not drawing attention. She was less good at resisting Clark Bailey. She met him on her 4th day in Redemption Creek, when he came into the general store to buy lamp oil and a new whetstone, and ended up spending 40 minutes in the shop not because he needed anything else but because, as Hazel later understood it, he was constitutionally incapable of walking away from an interesting person without first figuring out what made them interesting. Clark Bailey was 30 years old and worked a small cattle operation about 4 miles north of town that he had built mostly alone over the previous 3 years. He was broad-shouldered and lean in the way that men get when they do hard physical work in the sun, with dark brown hair that was always slightly overdue for a cut and hazel eyes, a coincidence that Hazel found privately amusing and never mentioned. He had a jaw that suggested stubbornness and a mouth that suggested kindness, and the combination gave him a face that was worth looking at for longer than was strictly polite. He introduced himself easily, the way men do when they are confident without being arrogant, and when she gave her name he said, "Hazel Bishop. That's a good, solid name," with such genuine simple approval that she felt an absurd flicker of guilt about it. They talked about lamp oil for 30 seconds, and then about whether the autumn had been unusually dry, and then about a book she had left on the counter, and then, before either of them quite noticed how it had happened, about things that had nothing to do with purchasing anything. He left eventually, lamp oil and whetstone in hand, and she watched him go with the uncomfortable awareness that she had smiled more in the last 40 minutes than she had in the previous 6 months combined. The next week, he came back for coffee beans. The week after that, for a new coil of rope. The week after that, with no stated purpose whatsoever, which Margaret noticed from the back room and said nothing about with the particular discretion of a woman who had been around long enough to recognize the shape of a man falling for someone. Hazel noticed it too, and she tried to be sensible about it. She told herself the things she always told herself, that she could not afford attachments, that she was not who he thought she was, that every person she had allowed close in the last 3 years had either been hurt by the association or had given her another reason to run. She told herself these things firmly and with conviction every evening in her small, clean room above the stable smell and the creak of the building, and every morning she came downstairs and was glad when the bell above the door rang and it was him. The town, meanwhile, was doing what small towns do. It was noticing. Redemption Creek had roughly 240 permanent residents, which meant it was large enough to have its own personality, but small enough that every deviation from the expected social order got catalogued and discussed. A new woman arriving alone, with no stated history and no apparent connections, was interesting enough. A new woman who Clark Bailey started finding reasons to visit 3 and 4 times a week was considerably more interesting. People were friendly to her, most of them. Marta Vega, who ran the laundry, brought her a piece of sweet bread on her second week and asked with genuine warmth where she was from. And Hazel said Philadelphia, which was partly true in the sense that she had once passed through Philadelphia on a train. Doc Hennessy, the town's single physician, a rumpled kind man of 60 with white hair and ink stains on his fingers, invited her to the church social and told her about the history of the valley with the enthusiasm of a man who had found his permanent home and wanted everyone else to love it as much as he did. But there were questions she couldn't answer. Questions about family and about why she had come alone and about whether she was meeting someone here or just passing through, and she gave vague, pleasant answers to all of them and moved on. She was practiced at this. She had been practicing for almost 3 years. What she was not practiced at was Clark. Clark did not ask the questions the way everyone else did. He did not ask them as a social formality or out of nosiness. When he asked about her, he asked with his full attention turned on her like a warm lamp, genuinely curious, genuinely interested in the answer. And this was so disarming that she found herself telling him things she had not intended to tell anyone. Not the true things, not yet, but real things. That she preferred evenings to mornings. That she had once read every book in a small lending library in Missouri during a winter that felt like it would never end. That she found the sound of wind in high country different from wind anywhere else, cleaner somehow, as though the altitude refined it. He listened to all of it like it mattered. 3 weeks after she arrived, he asked her to ride with him on a Sunday afternoon to see the far edge of his property, where the foothills opened into a meadow that he said was worth the trip. And she said yes before she had fully finished thinking through whether she should, and then felt the particular helpless alarm of someone who has just stepped off a ledge they were certain they would avoid. The meadow was, in fact, worth the trip. It sat in a natural bowl between 2 ridges, gold with late autumn grass and edged with scrub oak that had gone copper and rust with the season. The sky above it was the saturated blue of the high desert, enormous and clear, and there was a silence to the place that felt intentional, as though the landscape had arranged itself specifically to make conversation either unnecessary or unusually honest. They sat on a flat outcropping of sandstone, and Clark brought out 2 apples from his saddlebag and offered her one with the same unceremonious ease with which he did everything, and she took it, and they sat for a while not talking while the horses grazed below the ridge. Then he said, "You know, nobody in this town seems to know where you came from." She went still. He was looking out at the meadow, not at her, and his voice was entirely without suspicion or sharpness. He said it the way you might say a thing you have been observing with gentle puzzlement, not like an accusation but like an invitation. "Why does no one in this town know where you came from?" he asked with genuine warmth. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the scrub oak and made a soft, continuous sound. "I suppose I haven't told them," she said. He turned to look at her then, and his expression was open, patient, not pushing, just present. "You don't have to tell me either," he said. "I just want you to know that I've been wondering. And that whatever the reason is, it doesn't change how I think of you." She looked at him for a long moment and felt something shift inside her chest, some deep-lodged resistance beginning to give way the way ice gives way in late winter, not all at once but incrementally and without the possibility of stopping once it has begun. "It's complicated," she said. "Most good things are," he said. She did not tell him everything that day, but she told him enough. She told him that her past was not safe, that she had left a situation that she could not go back to, that there were people who might come looking for her. She did not give him names or specifics. She watched his face as she spoke, and what she saw there was not alarm or judgment or the particular self-protective withdrawal she had learned to expect when she dropped even partial truth on people. What she saw was consideration, careful, serious, respectful consideration. "Are you in danger now?" he asked. "I don't think so," she said. "I've been careful." "How long have you been running?" She looked at the copper oaks. "About 3 years." He was quiet. Then he said, "That's a long time to be carrying something alone." She had not cried in front of another person since she was 23 years old, and she did not cry now, but it was close. She held it down and nodded once, and he did not press further. He simply sat with her in the meadow until the light changed, and it was time to ride back. And on the way he pointed out a red-tailed hawk riding a thermal above the ridge and told her its wingspan was roughly 4 feet. And that he had watched one catch a jackrabbit once from over 100 yards up, which was the kind of random, generous information he offered regularly, and which she found, inexplicably, deeply comforting. Over the following weeks, the relationship between them deepened in the quiet, dailiness way that genuine connection tends to deepen, not in grand gestures but in accumulated small ones. He brought her a copy of a novel he had read and thought she might like. She saved back a specific coffee blend she knew he preferred before it ran out. He helped her carry a delivery of heavy flour sacks up the narrow stairs to the storeroom when he happened to be in the shop, and she was managing alone. She mended a tear in his jacket one afternoon when he mentioned it in passing, and returned it the next day without making a ceremony of it. The town watched all of this with the warm, proprietary interest that small communities take in the romances of their residents, and Hazel felt it, the way you feel something good building around you, and tried not to let herself rely on it too heavily. Because she knew, she always knew in the back of her chest where the anxiety lived, that the past had not finished with her. Her real name was not Hazel Bishop. Her real name was Eleanor Voss, and she was the former common-law wife of a man named Silas Greer, who operated a protection racket across 3 counties in central Kansas in the late 1870s, and who was, without any romantic embellishment, one of the most dangerous men she had ever been unfortunate enough to love at 19 and desperate enough to stay with until 23. Silas had charm the way certain snakes have beautiful markings, something that worked on you before you understood what it meant. He was magnetic and generous, and she had been very young and very alone when they met. And by the time she understood what he actually was, the understanding arrived the hard way, through things she witnessed and things she was implicated in simply by proximity, through debts he made in her name and secrets he kept that became her secrets whether she wanted them or not. She had left him in the winter of 1879 with a bruised jaw, $60, and a determination so absolute it felt almost like something outside herself, something installed in her rather than chosen. She had ridden south on a borrowed horse and then east on a train and then west again, and for the first year she had been terrified every single day. The second year less so. The third year here. She had not told Clark any of this in the meadow. She had given him the shape of it without the contents. She thought about telling him the rest regularly. She thought about it especially in the evenings when the store was closed and the town was quiet, and she could hear the distant music from the silver bit drifting up through her window. She thought about it the way you think about setting down a heavy thing, with longing and with the specific fear that setting it down will somehow make you fall. In the first week of November, 3 things happened in quick succession. First, Clark kissed her. It happened outside the church after the Sunday service, which she had begun attending not for religious reasons, but because it was the social center of the town and she was trying, carefully and intentionally, to belong somewhere. The congregation had filed out into the cold, bright morning air, and Clark had fallen into step beside her, and they had walked to the edge of the churchyard where the cottonwoods stood bare and silver, and he had stopped and turned to her and said, without preamble, "I would very much like to kiss you, Hazel, if that would be all right." The formality of it made her laugh, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and she said, "It would be all right." And he kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything, unhurried and completely present, and she felt the whole complicated architecture of her careful self begin to tilt on its foundations in a way that was frightening and also undeniably wonderful. Second, Margaret Bishop called her aside that same evening and told her, with the measured kindness of a woman choosing her words with care, that a man had come by the store while Hazel was at church asking whether anyone by her description had recently arrived in town. "What did you tell him?" Hazel asked. Her voice was very steady. "That I couldn't say," Margaret said, "which is the truth since you haven't told me much. But Hazel, I run a store in a small town. I am not in the business of protecting strangers from questions. If someone comes back with a harder inquiry, I can't make you promises I don't know I can keep." "I understand," Hazel said. "Thank you for telling me." "Is there something I should know?" Margaret asked. Hazel looked at the older woman's face, at the frank, unsentimental concern there, and made a decision. "There's a man who has been looking for me for 3 years," she said. "He has no legal claim on me, but he is not the kind of man who respects that. I left him and he has not accepted it." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Does Clark Bailey know?" "He knows some of it." "Tell him the rest," Margaret said simply. "That man deserves to know what he is walking into." Third, Hazel found a note slipped under her door that night. It was a single piece of paper, the kind you could buy at any dry goods counter, and it said, "I know where you are. We have things to discuss." She sat on the edge of her bed with the note in her hands for a long time. The lamp threw orange light on the walls. The building creaked. Below, the stable smelled of hay and horse. She had a choice to make. She could run again. She had the skills for it, the practice, the internal machinery of flight that she had built through repetition until it operated almost automatically. She could be out of Redemption Creek on the morning stage with her traveling bag in 40 minutes if she chose it. She thought about the meadow, about the red-tailed hawk, about Clark's hands when he offered her the apple, the ease and the completeness of the gesture, about the way he had said, "That's a long time to be carrying something alone." She put the note in the drawer of the small table beside her bed. She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark with her eyes open and made a different kind of decision. She would not run. The next morning, before the store opened, she went to find Clark. His ranch was 4 miles north of town on a dirt track that followed the creek bed until the land opened into the dry bench where he had built his house, a solid, practical structure of adobe and timber that looked like a man had built it planning to stay. He was in the yard behind the house repairing a section of fence when she arrived, and he saw her coming across the field and straightened up and waited. And the fact that he simply waited without walking to meet her, giving her the dignity of approaching on her own terms, made her want to weep for reasons she could not have articulated. She stood at the fence and told him everything. His name, his nature, what she had been involved in by association, the 3 years of running, the borrowed name, the note under the door. She told it straight and without embellishment, watching his face, and his face went through things. She could see it, processing and weighing and feeling, but it never went cold, it never closed. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. He set down the fence tool he had been holding. "Your real name," he said. "What is it?" She had not said it aloud in 3 years. "Eleanor Voss." He said it back to her once, quietly, as though he was placing it somewhere careful. Then he said, "What would you like to do about him?" She had expected almost any response except that one. Not "what should we do," not "what are we going to do," "what would you like to do?" The agency of it stopped her. "I don't want to run any more," she said. "All right," he said. "He's dangerous. I want to be honest about that." "I appreciate it," he said. "So am I when it matters." She looked at him for a long moment. "You don't have to be involved in this, Clark." He picked up the fence tool again, examined it, set it back down. "Hazel," he said, and he used the name she had given him, not the real one, understanding somehow that she needed both to be true. "I have been involved since the moment I decided I wanted to know you. I made that decision myself, with the information I had at the time. Now I have more information. My decision hasn't changed." She gripped the fence post with one hand, steadied herself, and said, "I think you should know that I have not been a woman who trusted easily for a long time, and that you have made it very difficult for me to maintain that as a general policy." He smiled at that, and it transformed his face completely. "I will take that as a compliment." "It is one," she said. He suggested they speak to Sheriff Aldrich. Hazel hesitated over this because Aldrich did not know her as Eleanor Voss, and she did not know how the sheriff would respond to the revelation that the woman working in the general store had been living under a false name. But Clark made the argument that they needed legal authority on their side before Silas Greer made his next move, and that Aldrich was a fair man who dealt with what was in front of him rather than what was in the past, and she trusted Clark's read of the town's social mechanics more than her own at this point. They went to the sheriff's office that afternoon. It was a plain room with a gun rack on one wall and a large desk with papers stacked in approximate piles and a wood stove that was working hard against the November chill. Aldrich was a man of about 65, thin as a fence post, with a long face and small, steady gray eyes that took information in without expressing much reaction. He listened to the whole story without interrupting. When it was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You're wanted for anything in Kansas?" he asked. "No," Hazel said. "I was never charged with anything. I was careful to ensure that. But this man Greer, he's got operations there. He did, as of 3 years ago. I don't know the current state of it. And he has no legal claim on you." "None." Aldrich tapped his desk once with 2 fingers. "Then his being here is not a legal problem for you. It may become a practical one." He looked at Clark. "You said he's made a threat." "A note," Clark said, "saying he knows where she is and has things to discuss." "Not a direct threat." Aldrich's mouth pulled slightly. "Technically. But a man who rides into another territory to find a woman who left him 3 years ago is not coming to have a polite conversation." He looked at Hazel. "You're going to want to watch yourself. I can't arrest him for walking into town, but if he does anything actionable, you come to me immediately. Day or night." "I will," Hazel said. "And the name situation," Aldrich said, and she braced. He looked at her with those small, steady eyes. "Margaret Bishop has spoken well of you since you arrived. I don't tend to put too much weight on what a name is versus who a person is. You're not on any paper I have. As far as Redemption Creek is concerned, you're Hazel Bishop, and that's fine by me." She released a breath she had been holding in some form or another for 3 years. That night, she and Clark sat in the chairs outside Margaret's store in the cold, each with a cup of coffee going cold in their hands, and talked until well past when they should have gone home. They talked about everything and nothing, filling in the spaces that the previous weeks had been carefully managed around, and the talking felt like removing weight from a long-carried pack, piece by piece, until she felt lighter than she had in memory. He told her things too, things about himself that were not tragedies but were honest. A father who had been demanding and difficult, a younger brother who had died of infection after a fall from a horse when they were teenagers, a failed engagement years ago to a woman who had decided the West was not where she wanted to build a life and had gone back east and married a banker and was reportedly very happy. He told it all without bitterness, with the same equanimity he brought to everything, and she thought that this was a man who had made his peace with the shape of his life, and that such men were rarer than they were supposed to be. When she finally stood to go inside, he caught her hand gently. "I want you to know something," he said. "The name doesn't matter. The past doesn't matter. The only thing that matters to me is who you are right now, and who you are right now is someone I am very sure about." She looked at him in the cold dark, with the stars overhead enormous and indifferent, and said, "I am not sure I have ever been sure of anything." "I'll be sure enough for both of us for a while," he said, "until you get there." She thought she might already be there. She was afraid to say it. She went inside and climbed the stairs and lay in her room in the dark, and for the first time in 3 years she felt, underneath the anxiety and the vigilance, something that was almost like peace. Silas Greer arrived in Redemption Creek on a Thursday morning in the second week of November, 1882. He came with two men Hazel did not recognize, which told her he had expanded his operation since she had left, that he was no longer the small-scale local extortionist she had known, but something with more reach and more resource, which was worse. He arrived on horseback, three men riding in from the South Road, and he was recognizable from a block away by the particular way he sat a horse, as if the horse owed him something. He was 41, a big man gone slightly to heaviness in the years since she had seen him, with a red face and pale, flat eyes and a wide mouth that could smile in a way that was indistinguishable from a threat, until you had known him long enough to understand the difference. He wore a good coat and good boots, and the overall impression was of a man who wanted to be taken for prosperous and respectable, which was the impression he had always cultivated, and which the people who dealt with him professionally generally found reassuring until it was too late. Hazel was behind the counter of the general store when she saw them ride past the window. Her hands went still on the coffee measure she was holding. She watched through the glass as Silas dismounted at the hitching post outside the silver bit and said something to his companions that made one of them laugh. Then he turned and looked directly at the window where she was standing. He had always been able to find her in a crowd. It was a skill she found, looking back, not romantic but predatory. He smiled. It was not a good smile. She set down the coffee measure, told the only customer in the store, old Mr. Hartley, who was 80 and partially deaf, that she would be back in a few minutes, went upstairs to her room, and checked that her Remington Derringer was loaded. Then she went out through the back of the store and across the back alley to the barber shop, where she knew that Clark would be getting his monthly haircut based on a conversation they had had 2 days before about how it was overdue. She was correct. He was in the chair. He saw her face in the mirror, and the barber had barely finished the sentence he was mid-through before Clark had stood up and taken money from his pocket and paid without counting it. "He's here," she said, outside on the narrow back step. "I know. I saw them ride in." He put on his hat, which the barber had hung on the peg. He was calm. It was the deliberate calm of a man who has decided in advance how he will behave in a situation rather than the absence of feeling, and she recognized it and was glad of it. "He has 2 men with him," she said. "I know. I'm going to talk to Aldrich before anything else happens." "Clark," she said, and caught his arm. "I need to be the one who talks to him. He came for me. If I don't talk to him, he'll just keep escalating until someone gets hurt." He looked at her with that direct, considered attention. "You're not doing it alone. I'm not asking to do it alone. I'm asking you not to make it worse by confronting him before I've had a chance to try to manage it." He was quiet for a beat. "What does managing it look like?" "I don't know yet, but Silas respects one thing, and that is the appearance of being outmatched. If he thinks I have nothing behind me, he'll push. If he thinks I have legal backing and community backing and someone who will make his life difficult, he might settle for having made his point and leave. And if he doesn't, then we'll deal with what's actually in front of us," she said. He nodded slowly. "All right, but I'm going to talk to Aldrich right now, and I'm going to be where I can see you." "That," she said, "I'm fine with." She went to the silver bit. The interior was the usual arrangement. A long bar along one wall, round tables in various states of occupation, an upright piano in the corner that nobody was playing at this hour of the morning. It smelled of sawdust and whiskey, and the particular accumulated smell of many men having spent time in a room with poor ventilation. Silas was at the bar with a glass of beer and one of his companions. The other was not visible, and this bothered her more than if she could see him. She walked to the bar and stopped 4 feet from Silas and said, "You wanted to talk." He turned and looked her over with the particular slow appraisal he used as a dominance display, and she held herself very still and met his eyes and did not look away. "Eleanor," he said, "you look well." "I go by Hazel now," she said, "and I am going to ask you to make this brief because I have work to return to." Something flickered in his flat eyes, a quick sharp irritation at the boundary she had just drawn. He covered it with the smile. "You're a hard woman to find, you know that. 3 years, 3 states." I am persistent, I'll give myself that. What do you want, Silas? He picked up his beer, took a sip, set it down, all of it theatrical, designed to make her wait, a habit he had that she used to mistake for confidence and now recognized as control. You left with something that belongs to me, he said. I left with $60 I had earned working in your household and a horse I returned 2 counties over, she said. I took nothing that belonged to you. You took yourself, he said simply. The bar had gone very quiet. The barman was pretending to dry glasses with great thoroughness. The man at the nearest table had stopped pretending to read his newspaper. I was never yours, she said. We were never married. I had no legal obligation to you and I owe you nothing. There's legal and there's real, Alina, and you know that better than most people. I built something. You were part of it. You know things that are inconvenient for me if they become known. There it was. Not the romantic claim she had half expected, the wounded pride of a man whose woman had left him. This was the actual thing, the cold calculation underneath the surface drama. She knew things about his operation, names and locations and methods, and she had never used that knowledge, had deliberately kept it sealed and unused because using it would have required her to stand up and be visible when visibility was dangerous. But he could not be certain of her silence. He had never been able to be certain of her silence, and that uncertainty had kept him looking for her. I have not said a word to anyone in 3 years, she said. And I have no way to verify that, do I? He was still pleasant, still smiling. This was the version of Silas that was most dangerous, the cordial version. What I'm proposing is a simple arrangement. You come back to Kansas with me. Quietly, we go back to the way things were and everything you know stays where it is. The air in the room felt thin. No, she said. His smile did not change, but the temperature behind it did. Alina, my name, she said with great precision, is Hazel Bishop, and I am going to walk out of this saloon now, and if you follow me or if you approach me again or if you or your men do anything that disturbs this town in any way, I will go directly to the sheriff's office and tell him everything I know about your operations in Kansas. Every name, every location, every method. I have kept your secrets for 3 years out of self-preservation, not loyalty. That can change. Silas looked at her for a long moment. You've gotten harder, he said. I've had excellent practice, she said. She turned and walked out of the saloon and across the street, and she kept her stride completely even and did not allow herself to hurry. She was almost back to the general store when she heard the footsteps behind her. Too fast. She turned, and the second man, the one who had not been visible at the bar, was behind her. And before she could reach for the derringer, there was a hand on her arm, and Silas himself was coming down the steps of the Silver Bit, looking not cordial any more but cold and focused. And then there was Clark. He was there because he had been where he said he would be, where he could see her, and what he saw had told him everything he needed to know. He stepped directly into the space between Hazel and the approaching man, not running, not dramatizing, simply there, and he said, "That's far enough," with a quietness that had more authority in it than a shout. The man stopped. Silas, on the steps, reached inside his coat, and that was when Clark said very clearly, "Don't." And from the doorway of the sheriff's office, 20 yards down the street, Sheriff Aldrich stepped out with his hand on his holster and said, at volume, "Is there a problem here?" This was the standoff that the town would talk about for years afterward. The shape of it. Silas Greer on the saloon steps with his hand inside his coat, his second man behind Hazel with his hand on her arm, Hazel herself perfectly still, Clark Bailey standing like a wall between Hazel and the man holding her arm, and Sheriff Aldrich coming down the middle of the street with his deputy at his left shoulder. Silas made the only calculation that a man in his position could make, which was that the odds were wrong. He had 2 men and a gun, and a set of intentions that had seemed manageable before he saw the entire social structure of Redemption Creek preparing to stand up against him. He removed his hand from inside his coat. He put his hands where they could be seen. "No problem," he said. "We're just talking." "The lady doesn't look like she wants to talk," Aldrich said. He stopped 10 feet from Sila's and looked at him with those small, steady eyes. "Are you passing through, friend, or planning to stay?" "Passing through," Sila said. His voice was perfectly controlled. "Then I suggest you pass," Aldrich said. "Now would be the right time." The man holding Hazel's arm released it. She stepped away from him and moved to Clark's side, and Clark put his hand briefly at her back, one firm, steady pressure, and then moved it away. Silas looked at Hazel across the dusty street. His face had gone past the performed expressions into something underneath them, something that was maybe the only genuine thing about him, and she could see the machinery of it, the calculation and the anger and the eventual acceptance of a man who is facing an equation he cannot change. "This isn't over," he said. "It is," she said. "Because if you come back, I will go to every sheriff in every county between here and Abilene. I will send letters to the federal marshals. I will write down everything I know and have it notarized and filed. I have been quiet for 3 years, Silas. I will not be quiet anymore." The stillness that followed this was complete. Then Silas Greer walked back into the Silver Bit, and 15 minutes later, 3 men rode south out of Redemption Creek and did not come back. Aldrich walked over to where she and Clark were standing. He looked at her arm where the man had grabbed it, already showing the beginning of a bruise. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Good." He looked at Clark. "You kept your head." "She did all the work," Clark said. Aldrich almost smiled. "That's what I hear." He tipped his hat and walked back to his office. The street was already returning to its normal activity, the slow resumption of ordinary business that communities manage even after extraordinary events, because there is always something that still needs to be done. Margaret was standing in the doorway of the general store with her arms folded, watching. When Hazel met her eyes, Margaret nodded once, a short, decisive acknowledgement, and went back inside. "Are you truly all right?" Clark asked, once they were alone, or as alone as you can be in the middle of a small town. "I'm shaking," she said, and she was, now that the adrenaline was releasing. "But I'm all right." He offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked to the end of the street and stood by the cottonwoods at the edge of the churchyard, which had become, without either of them deciding it, their place. "Do you think he'll actually come back?" Clark asked. "No," she said. She had thought about it as she had watched him ride out, had run the calculation through the lens of everything she knew about him. "He came here for leverage. I took the leverage away by making it clear I was willing to use what I know. He'll find another angle with someone else somewhere else. That's what men like him do." She paused. "I should have done that years ago, made that declaration, instead of running." "You did what you needed to do to stay safe," he said. "I did what I knew how to do," she said. "Those aren't always the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "What would you like to do now?" She almost laughed at the echo of the earlier question, the same construction, the same return of agency. "I would like," she said carefully, "to stop being someone who is waiting to leave. I would like to stop keeping a travel bag packed and the door calculated. I would like to live somewhere." "Here?" he asked. "If that is still a possibility," she said, "given everything you now know." He turned to look at her, and she looked back, and the November light came through the bare cottonwood branches and lay in shifting patterns on the ground. "Hazel," he said, and she loved the way he said it, the name she had chosen for herself, the name that was hers in a way the one she had been born with maybe never fully was. "I would like very much to give you a reason to stay." She reached up and put her hand against his face, and he covered it with his, and right there in the churchyard in front of anyone who happened to look, she kissed him, and it felt like something being put to rest. The weeks that followed were the best of her life. She thought this clearly, not with qualification or suspicion, but with simple clarity, measuring them against every other week she had lived. They were the best. She and Clark began building a life together with the same unhurried, deliberate attention he brought to everything. He started finding reasons to come into town every day rather than 3 times a week, and then finding reasons to stay through the evening. And then the evenings became habits that Margaret noticed and did not comment on except to once, with perfect dryness. extend the store hours by half an hour on the excuse that the winter light was holding. He took her to his ranch on a Sunday afternoon in December, when the first real snow had come, and laid itself over the bench above the creek in a clean white cover, and walked her through the house, which was solid and warm with a good stove and rooms that had the slightly bare quality of a place where a man has been furnishing his life only to its minimum necessary extent, leaving spaces he may have known were for something he hadn't found yet. She stood in the main room with its flagstone floor and its view of the snow-covered foothills and thought, without permitting herself to rush past the thought or deflect from it, that she could imagine living here. The specific, concrete, daily work of imagining it, where she would put a chair, what she might grow in the kitchen garden, whether the south-facing window got enough light in winter for the herbs she knew how to keep. Clark, watching her face, said nothing, but his expression was the particular expression of a man who has heard an answer without a question being asked. He did ask the question properly, in the way that things are supposed to be done, in February of 1883, 3 months after Silas Greer had ridden south, and the town had resettled itself around the fact of her. He asked it in the meadow, the same place where he had first wondered aloud why no one in the town knew where she had come from. The grass was dead and flat under its winter coat, and the scrub oaks were bare, but the sky was the same saturated blue, and the silence was the same quality, that honest particular silence, and he had apparently been planning this because he had brought not just 2 apples but a small bunch of dried wildflowers from the previous summer that he had kept somewhere, and which she found touching in a way she would not be able to adequately explain to anyone. He said, "I know I am asking this of a woman who has been through considerable difficulty in trusting people, and I want to be clear that there is no pressure attached to this question in any form, but I would like to spend the rest of my life with you, Hazel Bishop, whatever name that turns out to be, and I am asking if you would consider marrying me." She looked at the dried wildflowers. She said, "My real name is Eleanor Voss." "I know," he said. "I'm asking Eleanor too." She took the flowers. She said yes. They were married in the whitewashed church at the end of Redemption Creek's Main Street on a Saturday in late April, 1883, when the desert was in its brief furious bloom, and the hills around the town were spangled with color. Margaret Bishop stood up for her, which was not something Margaret would have predicted herself doing when a stranger arrived on the afternoon stage 6 months before, but which felt, she said afterward, completely right. Clark's nearest neighbor, a rancher named Pete Dawson who had been his friend for 3 years, stood with Clark. The whole town came. Not because they had been formally invited, but because in a town of 240 people, a wedding is a communal event whether you have been specifically asked or not. Marta Vega brought sweet bread. Doc Hennessy cried behind his spectacles and was unembarrassed about it. Sheriff Aldrich attended and shook Clark's hand with real warmth, and nodded to Hazel with the specific nod of a man who has decided something and will not be revisiting it. Hazel wore a dress of dark blue cotton that she and Margaret had made in the evenings over the previous month, simple and well-fitted, and she carried the dried wildflowers that Clark had brought to the meadow, tied with a piece of silk ribbon Margaret had donated from her personal collection. She walked up the aisle of that small church on her own, which was how she wanted it, under her own power and her own volition, and she met Clark at the altar and looked at his face and felt, as she would later describe it to herself in the private accounts she kept, the absolute cessation of running, the full stop after years of movement. The ceremony was brief, and the dancing afterward was not. Someone brought a fiddle, and someone else had a guitar, and the floor of the church social hall was given over entirely to the kind of dancing that happens when a community is genuinely happy for someone, big and generous and indiscriminate in who it sweeps in. Hazel danced with Clark first, and then with Doc Hennessy, and then with Pete Dawson, who was terrible at it and knew it, and was cheerful about the knowledge. And she danced with Margaret, who turned out to be surprisingly good, and who danced with the focused efficiency of a woman who decides to do anything properly or not at all. Clark watched her across the room at one point, across the noise and the movement and the lamplight, and caught her eye. And the look that passed between them was not the dramatic look of novels but something better, the look of two people who have found each other in the full knowledge of what they are and are choosing it anyway. They moved to the ranch, the two of them, in the beginning of May when the weather had fully turned, and the grass was coming up green on the bench above the creek. Hazel kept her work at the general store because she enjoyed it and Margaret needed her, and she had never been a woman who wanted to be anywhere except in the middle of things. But she was home at the ranch in the evenings, and the evenings were warm and full, and entirely unlike any evenings she had previously known. She wrote a letter that spring to the family of the real Hazel Bishop, the young woman from Kansas whose name she had borrowed. She had tracked them down through some careful inquiries, an aunt in Missouri. She wrote the letter as Eleanor Voss, not as Hazel Bishop, and she said only that she knew a grave in Kansas belonged to a young woman named Hazel Bishop, and that she had visited it, and that it was tended, and that she thought Hazel Bishop had deserved better than a short life and an unmarked passing. She did not explain further. She sent the letter and received no reply, which was fine. It was not a letter that required one. She thought of herself as Hazel. She had come to a place, slowly and not without deliberate effort, where she understood that the name was hers now, that she had inhabited it long enough and with enough full personhood that it was real. She was Hazel Bailey as of May 1883, and Eleanor Voss was not a person she was hiding but a person she had been, one chapter in a story that had turned out to have more of them. In the summer of 1883, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Clark on a Tuesday evening while they were on the porch of the ranch house watching the last light go off the foothills. She said it plainly because that was how she had come to tell things, and she watched his face process it in real time, the full arc of the response, surprise into calculation into wonder, and then he laughed. Not in disbelief or nerves, but in pure, uncomplicated gladness, and he reached over and took her hand and held it, and she looked at the foothills going dark and felt the specific deep quiet of a person whose life has turned out to be something they did not dare imagine. Their son was born in March of 1884. It was a hard birth. Doc Hennessy came out to the ranch with Margaret, who had appointed herself auxiliary support without being asked, and it took the better part of a day, and there were hours in the middle of it when Hazel was too occupied with the work of surviving to think about anything else. And then there was a moment when it was done, and the weight of a new person was placed against her chest, and she heard the voice of that new person for the first time, and she held on. Clark had been pacing the front room for 9 hours. When Hennessy opened the door and said, "She's well and you have a son," the sound Clark made was something Hennessy would mention years later as one of his most reliable professional memories. Pure, undisguised relief. They named the boy James after no one in particular, simply because it was a good solid name, and Clark said it with the same simple approval he had once said her name. James Clark Bailey formally, though from the day he arrived he was simply James. The child was a serious baby who looked at the world from very early on with Clark's deliberate, considering expression, and who slept with the focused efficiency of his grandmother Margaret, who visited regularly and took fierce, quiet pride in the baby without ever saying so directly, which was entirely in character. The ranch changed with the child in it. Not completely, not in the ways that fear had sometimes suggested to Hazel when she had thought ahead during the pregnancy, imagining loss of self, loss of the particular quality of their life together. It changed in the way that things change when they grow, expanding rather than replacing, taking up new rooms rather than overriding the old ones. James was 4 months old when Hazel went back to work at the general store part-time. Margaret, who had been anticipating this, had already arranged a corner of the back room with a small, safe space where the baby could be kept during the hours. This was Margaret's way of saying she was glad. Hazel worked 3 days a week and was at the ranch the other 4, and the balance of it suited her in a way that felt considered rather than accidental. She had been building this life deliberately, piece by piece, and the fact that it worked was not luck but construction. Clark's cattle operation grew in 1884, the year James was born. He hired 2 hands, a quiet older cowboy named Henry Raines who had been working ranches across New Mexico for 15 years, and a younger man barely 20 named Thomas Bright who was enthusiastic and competent, and who was slightly in awe of Hazel in a way that she found entertaining, and Clark found amusingly obvious. The ranch became a going concern. Not wealthy, not dramatically successful in the way of the big operations further south, but solid, reliable, growing by increments through hard work and careful management, the kind of success that does not make news but sustains a life completely. In the summer of 1885, when James was 15 months old and pulling himself up on everything in the house with the determination of a very small person with large ambitions, Hazel began to suspect she was pregnant again. She was right. Their second child was born in February of 1886, a girl with Hazel's gray eyes and Clark's dark hair, and they named her Anna. She arrived easier than James had, or perhaps it simply seemed easier because Hazel had been through it once, had the measure of it, and because by February of 1886 she had been living in Redemption Creek for almost 4 years, and it was hers in a way that still sometimes surprised her with its completeness. James, 23 months old when his sister arrived, examined her with serious skepticism for approximately 2 weeks and then decided she was acceptable, which was the beginning of a sibling relationship that would occupy many subsequent years of their parents' attention. The town had grown in those years too. Redemption Creek was approaching 400 people by 1886, and there was talk of a proper school, which Hazel got involved with because she believed in it structurally, in the idea that the children of a frontier town deserved access to the same education as children anywhere else. And she had strong opinions about how it should be organized and who should teach, and what the curriculum should prioritize that she expressed at community meetings with a frankness that some people found initially surprising and subsequently relied on. She became a person in the town. Not just Clark Bailey's wife, not just Margaret's counterwoman, but Hazel Bailey, who had opinions and capabilities and a history that the town now knew the outlines of because she had stopped hiding it. Not performed frankness, not deliberate self-revelation as a social tactic, but the natural openness of a person who has set down the weight of concealment and found that the world does not, in fact, collapse. She was 30 years old in 1886, the year Anna was born, and she thought sometimes about the woman she had been at 23, packing a bag in the dark in a Kansas farmhouse with a bruised jaw and $60. She thought about her with compassion, and without the contempt that frightened young women sometimes have for their own past selves once they have come through something. That woman had done what she needed to do. She had run when running was right, and she had stopped running when stopping was right, and both had taken a kind of courage that Hazel did not minimize. She was 32 when she wrote, finally, a proper account of what she knew about Silas Greer's operations in Kansas. She had heard from a contact in Santa Fe, a former acquaintance of Margaret's who had connections across the territory, that Greer had expanded and was by 1888 involved in activities that had drawn federal interest. She wrote the account carefully and specifically, with names and dates and locations, and sent it to the federal marshal's office. She signed it Aliner Voss because that was the name that was attached to the knowledge. She never heard directly what happened as a result. But a year later, the same Santa Fe contact sent Margaret a brief note saying that Silas Greer had been arrested in Abilene on charges related to extortion and fraud, and that he was expected to spend considerable time in federal custody. Margaret gave Hazel the note across the store counter one morning as though it was a routine delivery. Hazel read it twice. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went back to the inventory she had been taking. That evening, she showed it to Clark. He read it and put it on the table and looked at her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Like it's over," she said. "Completely over, not just managed but done." "Good," he said, and pulled her close and held her for a moment in the kitchen with the evening light coming through the window and James making some kind of complex constructive noise in the front room with wooden blocks and Anna asleep upstairs. And she rested her forehead against his shoulder and felt the overness of it move through her like a long breath finally released. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right. I have been thinking about it for a while, about the right way to say it, and I have decided there is no right way, so I am going to say it plainly." "That seems wise," he said. "I spent 3 years not being anyone, not belonging anywhere, not letting myself be known. And then I came here and you asked me why no one knew where I came from, and you asked it like it was an interesting puzzle rather than an accusation. And that was the first time in 3 years that a question about me felt safe to stand next to." She paused. "I don't know if you understood what that meant to me at the time. I'm not sure I understood it then. But I understand it now. That question, the way you asked it, was the beginning of everything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I remember thinking that there was something important about you that I didn't know and that I very much wanted to. I didn't know how to say it except directly." "That is exactly what you did," she said. "You said it directly and with warmth, as if not knowing where I came from was an interesting thing rather than a suspicious one. And it gave me something to respond to. It gave me a door." "You walked through it on your own," he said. "You left it open," she said. He kissed her temple, a small, ordinary, complete gesture, and then they pulled apart because James had apparently made a decision about the structural limits of his block construction, and there was a crash followed by the specific silence that precedes either a laugh or a cry, and they both turned toward the front room. It was a laugh. The school opened in September of 1889. It was a proper building, better than anyone had initially proposed, with 2 rooms and good windows and a teacher named Miss Acaffer who had come from a Negro normal school in Kansas, and who arrived with a trunk full of books and absolutely no patience for the suggestion, made by a very small number of people in the town, that perhaps her credentials needed verification. Hazel had been on the building committee and had been specifically involved in the hiring, and when the question of Miss Acaffer's credentials was raised at a meeting by a man named Hargrove who owned the feed store, Hazel had said with complete clarity that Miss Acaffer's credentials were impeccable and her character was excellent, and that the committee was fortunate to have secured her, and that was the end of that discussion. James started school that September. He was 5 3/4, serious and curious, and almost alarmingly ready for instruction, and he came home on the first day with 3 things he had learned that he was determined to share at dinner, and both Clark and Hazel sat at the table and listened to all 3 with the complete attention he deserved. Anna, 3 and impatient about not yet being old enough for school, was compensated by the fact that she had taken a comprehensive interest in the chickens that Hazel kept, and was allowed to be the one who collected the eggs every morning, a responsibility she took extremely seriously. The year 1890 brought 2 things of note. First, a drought that tested the ranch and every ranch in the valley through a long, dry summer, and through which Clark managed with the careful husbandry of a man who had planned for contingency, selling off some of the herd before prices dropped and holding the core stock through the worst of it with water hauled from the creek and supplemental feed bought early. It was a year of lean margins and long hours and a specific particular anxiety that Hazel had not felt since the years of running, not for herself now but for the things she had built, the life that mattered to her and that she wanted to protect. Second, she discovered in late autumn that she was pregnant for the 3rd time. she told Clark in the kitchen after the children were in bed, with the lamp turned low and the first cold of the autumn coming under the door, and he sat across the table from her and his face moved through its range and landed on a wide, warm smile. "The drought year," he said. "Apparently," she said. "Are you happy about it?" She considered. She was tired. The ranch had taken everything this year. She was 34, which was not old but was not 26 either. She was happy. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Enormously," he said. Their second son was born in June of 1891, in the warm early summer, an easier birth than either previous one. They named him Robert, after no particular Robert, just because it was a good name that fit him the moment they tried it. And from the first days, he was lighter in temperament than his serious older brother, quick to smile, interested in sound and motion in a way that suggested a child who would be good company. James was 7 when Robert arrived and Anna was 5, and they received their new brother with the different textures of their different natures. James solemnly, with a new sense of responsibility that he seemed to have decided upon independently, and Anna with practical enthusiasm and the immediate question of when he would be old enough to help with the chickens. By 1891, Redemption Creek had grown to nearly 600 people and was on the stagecoach line, and had a telegraph office and a second saloon, and a doctor who had come to assist the aging Doc Hennessy, who was slowing down but not stopping. It was a real town now, not the frontier outpost it had been when Hazel had arrived nearly 9 years before, and the change was one she tracked with the particular awareness of someone who remembered its beginning. She was woven into it. She was on the school board and she was friends with Marta Vega, and she exchanged letters with Miss Acaffer's mother in Kansas, and she and Margaret had Sunday dinner together most weeks, and she was friends with Pete Dawson's wife, Clara, who had arrived in 1886, and who was the kind of friend who will tell you the truth about things even when it is not comfortable. She had a life that was built and inhabited and tended, and the building and inhabiting and tending of it was the work she had chosen, and she was good at it. Clark was 40 now, and she was 35, and they were still, unmistakably, in love. Not in the way of early love, the constant heightened awareness, the difficulty of thought in each other's proximity. In the way of grown love, the kind that has been tested and has held, that knows the other person's silences and their capacities and their specific, particular nature and values that knowledge as the deepest form of intimacy. They were known to each other, completely and without reservation. And being known, after years of hiding, was the thing that Hazel Bailey could not measure the value of because it exceeded any scale she had available. She thought sometimes about the girl she had been at 19, choosing the wrong man with the best intentions she had at the time, and she thought about the woman at 23, leaving with $60 and a borrowed horse, and she thought about the woman at 26 arriving at a sun-bleached frontier town with a borrowed name and a packed bag and the habit of watching doors, and she felt for all of them the same complete, uncomplicated compassion. They had all been doing their best with what they had. And the best had brought her here. Here was the ranch above the creek with the view of the foothills. Here was the whitewashed town with its school and its church and its social hall. Here was Margaret, who had been the first person in Redemption Creek to decide that whatever Hazel's past was, her present was sufficient recommendation. Here was Doc Hennessy with his white hair and his ink-stained fingers, and his tendency to cry at weddings and births and school openings with equal enthusiasm. Here was Miss Acaffer teaching James, and then Anna mathematics and history and literature with a rigor and a warmth that would mark them both for life. Here was James, now 7, who had Clark's eyes and Hazel's capacity for honest observation, and who was already the kind of child who noticed things about people, and kept the noticing to himself, until he had something useful to do with it. Here was Anna, 5, who had Hazel's gray eyes and Clark's stubbornness, and a complete confidence in her own competence that Hazel found delightful and occasionally exhausting. Here was Robert, just arrived, who had not yet shown them who he would be except that he was sunny and loud about it. Here was Clark, sitting across from her in the kitchen in the low lamplight with his hands around a coffee cup, asking her something about the water situation on the south pasture, and she looked at his face and thought, "This is the person who asked me a question with genuine warmth once, who wanted to know where I came from, not to catch me but to know me, and I am so glad he asked." She said this. She put it into words, right there at the kitchen table with the baby asleep upstairs and the older two asleep down the hall and the fire low in the stove and the New Mexico darkness outside the windows complete and starred. She said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "What?" he asked. "That afternoon in the meadow, the first time we went, when you asked me why no one in town knew where I came from." He remembered. She could see it in his face, the specific warm recall of a particular moment preserved in the tissue of a shared life. "I asked it because I genuinely wanted to know," he said. "Not the information exactly. More, I wanted to understand what had shaped you into the person I was already finding so compelling." "I know," she said. That was exactly what I heard in it, not suspicion, not a trap, genuine curiosity, genuine warmth. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "It was the first moment I thought maybe this was somewhere I could stop." "And did you?" he asked. "Stop." She looked at him across the table in the low lamplight with the three children breathing in their rooms and the foothills dark outside and the town of Redemption Creek a mile down the road, folded into the valley under the enormous western stars, and she said, "I stopped completely." He reached across the table and took her hand. Outside, the wind was in the high country, clean and cold, coming down off the Sangre de Cristos with the quality that Hazel had noticed on her first day in the valley, the altitude refining it, making it cleaner than wine anywhere else she had been. She had said this to Clark once in those early weeks, and he had listened to it with complete attention and said, "I know exactly what you mean," which had been, she now understood, the first moment she had fully trusted him. Outside, the stars were the same stars that had watched her cross 4 states and 2 territories with a borrowed name and a packed bag and no particular destination except away. They were impersonal and ancient and entirely uninterested in the small human stories that played out beneath them, but she was not impersonal. She was very particular, very specifically herself, very completely here. Hazel Bailey, formerly Eleanor Voss, formerly no one at all. Home. In the morning, Robert woke them at 5 with the cheerful totality of a baby who considers the distinction between night and day a matter of opinion. And Clark took him and walked with him in the kitchen so Hazel could sleep another hour. And she lay in the early warmth of the bed and listened to the low murmur of her husband talking to their son, explaining something about the weather by the sound of it, or possibly the cattle, in the patient, interested voice he used for people he was trying to know. And she closed her eyes and let the sound of it fill the room. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world, and she had come to it the long way, and she was glad of every mile. The years that followed were full ones. James grew into a thoughtful, measured young man with a talent for the ranch work that he approached with the same analytical care he brought to everything. Anna, once she was old enough, showed she had inherited both her parents' stubbornness and something of her father's ease with people and something of her mother's capacity for directness, a combination that made her a natural leader among the children in the school and later in the town itself. Robert turned out to be the musician of the family, which surprised everyone and which he announced by demonstrating, at age 6, that he had been teaching himself the harmonica by ear without telling anyone. Miss Acaffer became Hazel's closest intellectual companion over the years, a woman who read everything and had opinions about all of it, and who challenged Hazel's thinking in ways she found not merely enjoyable but necessary, the specific necessity of someone who knows they need to keep sharpening themselves or go soft. They started a small lending library in the school in 1893, collecting donated books and eventually funds for purchased ones. and it grew by 1900 into the first proper library Redemption Creek had, housed in a room added to the school building specifically for the purpose. Margaret Bishop died in the winter of 1895, at 75, in her own bed above the store she had run for 30 years, with Hazel holding her hand. She left the store to Hazel in her will, which Hazel received as the profound gift it was, the formal acknowledgement of a relationship that had begun as employer and employee, and had become, over 12 years, something closer to the family they had both not had much of. Hazel kept the store and its name, Bishop's General Store, because it was Margaret's legacy and because, in the curious recursive logic of her life, the name Bishop had been hers too for a long time. She ran the store for another 10 years before selling it, eventually, to a young couple from Albuquerque who wanted exactly the kind of established small-town business it was. By then, the ranch was enough and more than enough, and James was old enough to be a genuine partner in it alongside Clark. In 1901, when Redemption Creek was celebrating the start of a new century with a town dance that ran until 2 in the morning and involved, by general estimate, most of the 612 people now living in the valley, Clark danced with Hazel to a slow song played by the fiddle player and the guitar player who had been playing at their wedding 18 years before. Older now, the fiddle player with white in his hair, the guitar player's hands showing the years in their joints, but still playing. Still making music for a town that had grown up around the sound of their instruments. She rested her head against Clark's shoulder, and they moved in the small, slow circles of people who have danced together enough times that the music is almost beside the point. "Are you happy?" he asked, not for the first time in their life together, but with the same freshness he always brought to it, as if the question were new, as if her answer still mattered to him to hear. "Perfectly," she said. He held her a little closer. Around them, the town of Redemption Creek danced into the 20th century, and the fiddle played, and the stars over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains were exactly as they had always been, enormous and ancient and completely indifferent. And beneath them, in the lamplight of the social hall with the music rising and the whole improbable, hard-won, beloved life extending in every direction around her, Hazel Bailey was exactly, completely, irreversibly home.